Why, hello there, dude. Welcome in. Thanks for joining me for today's video, of which we're going to be speculating about the potential of the Elden Ring Tarnished Edition. To do so, we're going to be taking a look at From Software's most recent title, Elden Ring Nightreign. Nightreign has a ton of brand new systems, as well as countless refinements to the overall formula that we've come to know and love. So, let's let the speculation run wild, shall we? Alright, let's get the consumable discussion underway, shall we? So, there's a lot of really cool additions that From Software made to consumables overall in Nightreign. And starting out, just without wasting too much time here, one of the best things that they included, and one of, I think, the most likely things to be implemented and brought forward into their future games, namely the Tarnished Edition, is the ability to throw while jumping, you know? Like, all sorts of different shit, right? You have the ability to jump throw pots, you can jump throw throwing knives, right? As well as kukris and all of the other different variations, right? Fan daggers as well. You also have the capability of jump throwing Cuckoo Glintstone, dude, which is a nice added touch. Very, very cool there. And then, of course, the Gravity Stone Chunk, which is extremely fucking cool, right? Yeah, dude, you know, like a lot of these improvements, you know, along these lines similarly, and of course we'll go over a lot of other additional points, too, a little bit later, of how they improved each and every consumable as well. But when I start thinking about the potential of a jump throw for the vast majority of consumables in the game, the first thing I think about is what that might look like for, you know, jump throwing colossal pots, where you queue it up, you hold it over your head midair, and then you know, your feet touch the ground before you throw it, right? It's just like, there's so much there, man, you know? And like, if you jump throw any particular consumable, it might end up giving you a little bit more stance damage than you would otherwise get by just throwing it on the ground, right? Because you have to sit through that upfront animation. All sorts of things like that, dude. There's so much potential to be had with the implementation of a system like this. And another thing that I wanted to mention in relation to all of this is, from strictly a PvP standpoint, there is an immense amount of potential associated with the ability to jump throw certain consumables because of the variability in timing. Whoever you're fighting has to worry about, oh, is he going to throw it at the height of their jump, or are they gonna wait until they land and delay it, right? So it's like roll catch city right there, baby, right? But yeah, dude, you know, like, that would be really fucking cool to see, you know, and add a whole nother layer of consumable combat depth that players would have to keep an eye out for, you know, and pay attention to, which I think is amazing, right? Just wanted to pop in here real quick, just to showcase some additional things in relation to the cracked pot items, and some of the very cool additions and advancements that From Software put forward and attached to specific thrown pots in Nightreign. So, one of the biggest things, and this pretty much applies to all of the predominantly offensive-based damage-dealing pots. So, using the fire pot as an example here, they actually gave all of the offensive-based pots a significant increase in blast radius. And as you can see here too, when compared to the base game, this is like 3 times the size of like visual effect explosion. And even then, the actual hitbox size has been increased significantly too, right? So that's something I wanted to mention. Now, moving on to the status pots, I guess you could say. So, throwing a poison pot here, this is something that they added in Nightreign as well, which I think is a very, very cool addition, which is, when you throw a poison pot, it creates a poison cloud that persists for a few seconds before dissipating, which, during that period, it heavily inflicts poison buildup, during the effect of the smoke cloud being there, right? So just a very cool addition to making poison pots feel a little bit more impactful as well, because they definitely are very underwhelming in the base game as it stands, right? So I think that would be a very, very cool addition. This is another really cool one right here with the fetid pot. So it's mirrored in functionality, basically very akin to what I just showcased with the poison pot, but what they tied to it additionally to make it stand out beyond the poison pot, outside of it, of course, causing deadly poison instead of normal poison, is when you throw it, it actually causes damage, right, over a short period of time during the poison cloud as well. And if you notice there up front initially, they actually made the impact of the pot itself deal a significant amount of damage, that being around the area of 70 damage, I do believe. Or, yeah, okay, so 60 there, and then it ticks up during, you know, the enemy persisting to exist within the poison cloud itself. So that's another very cool addition to making fetid pots feel a little bit more impactful. And I mean, for fuck's sake, dude, you know, when you throw a fetid pot, right, it's you're running the risk of inflicting poison on yourself by throwing it. So I think the addition of having it do a little bit more upfront damage and having that damaging poison cloud that persists for a few seconds is a very, very cool way to buff them and give them more of a reason to actually be used and to exist, right? So pretty much everything that I stated about the fetid pot right there can also be applied to the rot pot. Outside of course, the upfront 60 damage, you know, hit where the pot actually coming in contact. The rot pot, of course, still does only do 1 damage up front with the actual pot hit, but they do keep the persistent damage cloud there associated with it, which is very, very cool, right? So the next one, freezing pot, very similar case, of course. And with the freezing pot, it actually does have that 60 or 70 upfront damage tick right there, right when the pot comes in contact with the enemy, but it actually it summons a frost cloud that is also damaging while the enemy is in it, and causes significant amounts of buildup therein. So, very, very, very cool, right? This one, Rancor pot, this one probably got the biggest glow up out of all of the pots, I would say. So, this is extremely cool. What they did is, so if you're unfamiliar, in the base game, a Rancor pot, it does not have any, like, upfront damage when the pot comes in contact with said enemy. So what they did here is they added a massive, like, ghost flame explosion when the pot actually lands and comes in contact with the enemy, which is extremely fucking cool, right? So it's buffed in that regard, but not only that, this is another thing that I wanted to mention too, because if you guys are unaware, the standing throne animation, there are, I believe there's just 2 discrepancies in between the throwing animations for pots. So most of the pots that take FP to throw in the base game, they actually have their own distinct animation, and you can probably see that pretty clearly here with the Rancor pot. You kind of hold it out behind your shoulder there, right, before you throw it, and then with a normal, more of the traditional pots, they just have that, you know, you kind of pull it out of your back pocket there, right, animation. So just wanted to focus on that for a second too, because just to showcase that, yes, indeed, both throwing pot animations did indeed receive the speed improvements on the baseline ground throw, which would be an exceptional improvement to bring forward as well, right? So yeah, just very, very cool changes to the pots in general. So, yeah, dude, just wanted to showcase this, but onward to the next segment, I suppose, dude. So, I guess one last thing in relation to the entire, like, cracked pot system. That was one of the innovations that From Software made with Elden Ring specifically, was that you got you basically fill the cracked pots with whatever ingredients that you want, and then depending on the ingredients that you then put into them, you can end up with a wide array of different options, as you can see here, all of the different variations, and subsequently, when you use them, you get the cracked pot back, right? So it's clear that From Software wanted to make the thrown pots more of a integral piece of your kit, you know, as you're playing through the game. Unfortunately, with a lot of the missteps taken with the crafting system, a lot of players never really engaged with the cracked pot system, which I find to be very unfortunate, you know. And just listing that out in that way, you know, I think a lot of players, like, if you give more means to be able to engage with, you know, these consumable-based systems like this, it's like maybe players are going to be a little bit more apt to want to utilize them, right? It's like, fuck yeah, dude, I wanna throw a pot mid-air, dude, you know? Like, it's just fucking cool, dude, you know? So I think the next thing we'll move on to is the ability to jump throw throwing knives, you know? That's a really fucking cool thing. And a lot of what I said, you know, already about the cracked pots, you know, and being able to be thrown mid-air can be applied directly to these as well, you know? Especially the difference between Kukris, you know, the Kukri knives and the normal throwing knives, because if you look at the difference, the normal throwing knives, you can kind of chain throw like this. They feel really good to throw. You can do sprinting animations with them. You can do dodge, you know, throws, things like that. And this is something that I wish From Software would do more with, like, all sorts of different consumables. I wish they would give them, you know, a sprinting throw animation. I wish they would give them a dodge cast, and, like, I want every consumable to ideally feel as good to use as the throwing knife does. But yeah, that's the big one, you know, being able to jump throw like a Kukri, because as I'm sure anyone who's ever engaged with the Kukri knife in the base game knows, it's so incredibly sluggishly slow, dude. To a degree where it's just like, why is it this slow to throw this thing, you know? And of course, you can see how much faster it is in Nightreign as opposed to the base game, and it's just like, dude, as an arcane enjoyer, you know, in the base game, an arcane build, it's all about bleed and poison and status ailments and stuff like that, right? And the Kukri knives, they scale, if I recall correctly, a C with arcane because they do bleed buildup, right? And I would love to have Kukris actually be a viable option for, like, a ranged bleed pop, you know what I mean? But as it stands in the base game, especially like in PvP, like, Kukris are just way too slow. Like, somebody can eat a bolus, you know, to cleanse their status bar before you can even think about trying to cast one of these, you know? So yeah, just more speed improvements across the board with a lot of consumables, I think would go a long way. And I think that that's a decently likely thing to make its way into the Tarnished Edition, especially if From Software is going back through the entirety of their experience and just trying to make it the best that it can possibly be, you know? As a game designer and game developer, you want players to engage with as much of the game as you possibly can. And when players aren't heavily incentivized or heavily encouraged to engage with a lot of these systems that you have in your game, it's like, that feels terrible, dude, you know? Like, you want players to engage with that as much as humanly possible. So, looking at it through that lens, I think a lot of these changes make a tremendous amount of sense. With that being said, let's jump into the next portion of the video. So, moving on from all that, dude, we got the Glintstone scrap. And you'll notice that I can maintain full movement while I am casting the Glintstone scrap item. In the base game, for both this one and the large Glintstone scrap, it puts you to a complete stop, right? Which, once again, this is a great improvement as to making these consumable items feel better to use, dude, you know? Like, you don't lose full character control when you're using, you know, these offensive-based consumables and things like that, which I think it's exceptional, dude. And the other thing, too, to note about this is you're probably noticing the functionality was changed with these in Nightreign. I'm not necessarily suggesting that this is a tremendous likelihood that each one will split to hit all three, but I think that that would go a long ways as to making these things feel more impactful, you know? Because, like, as a limited consumable, you want a limited offensive-based consumable to fucking pack a punch and to have a reason to exist. And as it stands, a lot of offensive-based consumables in the base game, they don't either have the functionality from a design standpoint to actually exist, and largely the biggest problem, which this was something that was addressed by Nightreign, thankfully, is that the damage of said consumables actually fucking packs a punch, dude. And once again, if you're spending the time to farm up a limited consumable, right, let alone it costs FP because this costs FP in the base game, it's like, you want those things to fucking hurt. So even just beefing up the damage and not even going as far as to, like, redo the functionality, like this, for example, you know, hitting multiple enemies at once, because in the base game, it just, each one only hits one particular enemy. So that's an example of Nightreign improving a consumable in both the functionality aspect and the damage aspect, right? So very, very cool therein. And obviously the large glintstone scrap has the same thing applied to it. So, you know, you don't come to a full stop. Each one that, you know, gets shot out goes to all of the enemies in the vicinity, right? So it's just, it's a very cool change, you know? It helps to make them feel a little bit better, a little bit more meaningful. And while we're on this same tangent here, if you guys are familiar with the this consumable actually isn't in Nightreign, which I would have liked to see how they would have changed it in Nightreign to make them a little bit more viable, but the two consumable items, I guess there's four, because there's the small version and then there's the large version. It's the small explosive clump and the large explosive clump, and then there's the poison and the large and small poison clump. Offensive-based items, which those, for anybody out there that's familiar with those consumable items, dude, they may as well not exist, you know? Like, they tickle enemies and they serve, like, no purpose. Thankfully, you know, with the poison clumps, if you're on an arcane build, they actually gave them arcane scaling, so they're decent buildup of poison, but even then, they're laughable in terms of buildup in comparison to other poison-based options that you have, you know? So it's like, I would like to see, overall, From Software just go back through a lot of their consumable design and reevaluate and actually really fucking beef them up, dude. Make them impactful. Make them have a punch. So, leading into the next consumable that we'll be talking about and really breaking down, it has quite the spark to it. This one's interesting, right? Because the Spark Aromatic is one of the only offensive-based consumables in the base game of Elden Ring that actually does pack a punch when you're on a pure dex build, because that's what it primarily scales with. So already, the Spark Aromatic is above most consumables, just based off of the fact that it actually deals damage. Two of the other very, very cool and important additions that were made to the Spark Aromatic in Nightreign is the ability to maintain full movement once again, similar to what we talked about earlier with the Glintstone scrap item. But not only that, you'll notice the free aim ability of it is just absurd, right? Like, God, dude, what I wouldn't give to have this level of free aim ability on the Spark Aromatic in the base game, right? Because that's another kind of cool, quirky piece of trivia, is the Spark Aromatic is my favorite item in Elden Ring. It's so fucking cool, dude, you know? I adore it so much. When I first found it, or when I first encountered the perfumer type enemies, right, in, I believe, Altus Plateau, I was just like, yo, that's so fucking cool, dude. Let me get a piece of that action. And then, obviously, I was over the moon to see that From Software was making perfume bottles their own weapon class and weapon type in Shadow of the Erdtree. But unfortunately, as I'm sure a lot of people know, perfumes ended up being one of, if not the worst weapon class in the entire game. And that was a shot to the old Frostman's pills, you know, straight up, dude. But, here's to hoping they get buffed in the future, dude. And while we're on the topic of perfume, we may as well cover the next in line, dude. That being, of course, the Poison Spraymist bottle, dude. Once again, as I mentioned earlier when I was talking about the Kukri knives, right? Me being an arcane main, dude, and an arcane build enjoyer, I was like, oh my god, this fucking seems so cool, right? You know? And then I take the time to farm up some materials to make it and shit, and then I get to experience the animation therein, and it's so fucking slow and bad, dude. It roots your character. You can't free aim it well. It's like super disjointed free aimability associated with it, right? And luckily, this is something that From Software did actually do decently well. They made the poison from the Poison Spraymist bottle actually have the, what I believe is either tied for the strongest form of deadly poison in the game, or it just is uniquely the strongest form of poison in the game, right? So at least there's that. You know, they made it strong in that regard, right? But explanations aside, dude, we'll showcase it here. So there's a couple of things, right, that they improved with this. Not only did they allow you the capability of full maneuverability and movement while casting it, right? And having this level of frameability on it, which is fucking amazing, right? But as you can see here, in addition to it actually doing the build-up and everything, right, they actually gave it a damaging hitbox that's associated with it as well when you spray it out, dude. And then the enemy is just sitting there in it, right? They take a little bit of additional damage therein, which I think is a very, very cool change, right? And making it a little bit stronger in a little bit more minute and muted way, but it's a buff all the same, man, so it's fucking sick, right? But yeah, moving on from there, everything I just stated about the poison spray mist can also be applied to the acid spray mist minus the upfront damage that you get while they are sitting in the cloud, right? So, with all of the offensive-based perfume items out of the way, dude, I think this is the perfect opportunity to have a discussion about the infinitely reusable FP-based consumable items, dude. I don't know about you guys, but like when I first came across like the Wraith calling bell, for example, I remember finding this on my first playthrough in Liurnia, and I was like, yo, dude, they brought back like Bloodborne, you know, like Bloodborne tools, basically, you know, because that's along the lines of like the design of what these are. You know, costing that resource, of course, in Bloodborne, it was Quicksilver bullets, you know, and in Elden Ring, it's FP. But you can use them indefinitely, you know, they're not a consumable that gets consumed, you know, on use. And I was a Faith build, you know, on my first run through, and I was like, oh my god, dude, the Wraith Calling Bell scales a D in Faith and, you know, a D in Int, right? And I was like, yo, dude, this thing's so fucking cool. And then I cast it, and I was messing around with it right when I got it. I was like, oh, fuck yeah, dude. This is so sick, you know, casting it. And I went and tested it on one of the ads, you know, in Limgrave. And then it just hit like a fucking wet noodle, you know? And like, I was a Faith build, which, you know, is one of the builds that it should scale with, right? And it just... so lackluster, you know? And obviously this is one of the things that Nightreign improves on so much with all of these reusable based items, you know? Like the Ancestral Infant Head, it shreds, dude. Like it does good fucking damage. And they actually changed the functionality of it to actually like go out in like a wave too, you know? As opposed to it just sitting in one particular spot, which I think is very cool too. But, like, these things actually do good damage as they're going through enemies, you know, as opposed to the base game where it's just, it does literally fucking nothing, dude, you know? So, once again, the functionality of the Ancestral Infant Head, this roots you in place in the base game. You know, like, now, you know, it allows you the full maneuverability and free aimability of it, right? Which is very cool. Obviously, making it deal more damage, things of that nature. And then even, I believe the Ancestral Infant Head is even a little bit faster to cast, which that is a theme with Nightreign with a lot of the consumables, as we have aforementioned thus far already, right? But yeah, dude, like, I would love to see the fucking Wraith Calling Bell get the treatment that it has in Nightreign, you know? Like, it actually deals fucking damage, you know? Like, up the D scaling from Faith and Int that it has in the base game to, like, a double B scaling. You know what I mean? Like, that's all it really fucking needs. And then it's actually a really cool item. You know, it has a reason to exist, because as it stands, there is no reason for it to exist, you know? And then even things like the Omen Bairn, you know? Like, I remember finding this too, and it was just like, why does this even exist? You know, dude, it's like, it's so bad. Like, the casting animation is so slow in the base game, it roots you in place, all of that. And it's just, the FP cost that it has is just so ridiculously high, it does not equal the amount of damage to FP ratio that should be the case. And, you know, as I'm sure a lot of people know, Elden Ring has a huge FP problem, FP cost problem. They definitely need to go back and reevaluate a lot of the FP costs for a lot of spells, incantations, and most importantly, Ashes of War, which are the ones that suffer from inequity in the FP department, you know, for a lot of the costs of the Ashes of War. But pretty much everything that I've said about the Wraith Calling Bell, it applies to the Regal Omen Bairn and the Omen Bairn as well, you know, and the Ancestral Infant Head, you know. Just that ability to actually walk while doing it, you know, and all of the projectiles going in, dude, you know, like, that's good fucking damage. If they were all hitting one concentrated target there, dude, that's like 600 fucking 800 damage, you know? So it's good shit, in other words. But almost done with the consumables here. We're largely through everything that I wanted to mention in relation to it. But even this, dude, you know, like the Gravity Stone Fan does more damage, and it's faster to cast, and it allows you some additional movement after rooting you to a full stop there towards the start of the animation, you know? So that would be a great change. And even, you know, the capability of being able to throw Gravity Stone chunks, you know, from the air, right? And obviously the animation therein is significantly faster too, you know? Which, that's a fucking W, dude. And also the Cuckoo Glintstone, you know? Like, I want this shit to be fucking better, dude, you know? Like, I love running an int build. And if I could jump throw this and have that as an option. And that's one of the cool things about the rework to this item too, is I believe in the base game, it doesn't have a explosion, right? So like when you actually throw it initially, they added a hitbox to it, kind of similar to how a pot does, right? But then also, not only that, the projectiles that spawn afterward, I think they doubled the amount that spawn. So instead of 3, it's either 5 or it's 6. I think it's 5. So like, just something like that, dude, you know? This is an incredible fucking glow up to an item that is largely fucking useless, you know? And it's just, I know I'm probably belaboring the point a little bit and beating a dead horse, but I want these things to have their time in the sun, you know? Alright, dude. A couple of other additional things I wanted to mention while we're on the topic of consumables in general. We have quite a few different things to showcase here, and largely what I'm going to be showcasing with this stuff is a lot of the buff-based consumable items, and essentially just showcasing a lot of the speed improvements that From Software assigned to them in Nightreign specifically. So, starting off with, of course, the Starlight Shard. The Starlight Shard item, it takes somewhere in the ballpark of around like 3 seconds, maybe even a little bit longer to actually consume and cast in the base game. But as you can see in Nightreign here, significantly faster, right? And this doesn't feel to the extent of where it's like, oh, this is too quick to cast for the, you know, the respective reward that you get out of it. So yeah, you know, like something like this would just be really fucking cool to see, you know, just making these super long casting animations for respective consumables just a little bit quicker, dude, you know, because they're bordering on like too slow in the game currently, dude, you know. Good luck trying to pop a consumable that takes upwards of 3 seconds of free time where you're not being like rushed or being hit by a boss or pursued by any particular enemy in the game, right? So yeah, just like an improvement like this for the massive outlier animations for specific consumable items, especially buff items, would be a very welcome change. Moving on to the boluses, obviously all of the bolus types have the same animation applied to them, and in Nightreign, I kind of wanted to showcase this as a, basically something not to do, because the Nightreign bolus eating animation is like, it makes sense, once again, in relation to Nightreign being the type of game that it is, being about speed, you know, and popping everything as fast as humanly possible, right? But the bolus animation's a little bit too quick, you know what I mean? He just throws up his hand, dude. There's no pulling it out of the pocket this time, dude. Out of the wing in Guardian's case, dude. But, yeah, this is definitely a little bit too quick, you know what I mean? Like, the bolus eating animation is pretty fucking, like, great where it's at in the base game currently, you know? And I think using that as, like, a benchmark for a lot of the other consumables, like what we're about to showcase here with the foul feet, right? The gold and silver, respectively. This animation is then shared by a lot of the other buff-based consumables, like boiled crab, pickled turtleneck, and, of course, exalted flesh and things of that nature, right? And this animation is extremely long too. Like it's about the same duration as the Starlight Shard use animation is in the base game, but I think the Starlight Shard animation does end up taking the cake. I think it's a little bit longer of an animation over the one that they have assigned to the buff-based items. But that being said, the buff-based items could use a little bit of a speed improvement too, dude, you know what I mean? And as we see right here in Nightreign, I think if they were somewhere along the lines of this, you know, because like, if you compare this to like where the bolus animation is in the base game, it's pretty equivalent, you know. And I think the base game bolus animation is probably where you wanna, you know, what you want to shoot for the vast majority of everything else, right? So yeah, and just showcasing, you know, the speed improvement to these respectively, you know. Once again, it's like you gotta have some room for nuance there. Like maybe these are a little bit too fast in comparison to the base game, but the point still stands, dude. You know, like these are a little bit too slow. They could stand to be a little bit quicker to use, right? But yeah, all that being said, we can move on to the next point here, which is the Physic Flask, right? And I think this is something that Nightreign did beautifully. The speed improvements to the flask drinking animation, absolutely exceptional, dude, you know, like, it's still relatively slow, but it's sped up just enough, basically to where it should be. And once again, the physic drinking animation in the base game is extremely fucking slow, dude, you know? But yeah, like, and just to reinforce the overall point once again, I do get that there's a piece of this discussion when it comes to speeding up certain consumable-based animations and things like that, where there's the cost-benefit, you know, associated with it, right? So it's like, oh yeah, depending on the relative strength or power that you are gaining, in this case, a lot of this stuff being buffs, right? There is a significant advantage that gets then applied to the character from interfacing with said consumable, right? But I don't think that these speed improvements would massively upset the balance in relation to, you know, like, oh yeah, dude, you know, we're gonna assign this animation a 4-second cast time for a consumable that ends up oftentimes lasting anywhere from 45 seconds to a minute and a half in certain cases, right? I think that whole argument kind of goes out the window more or less in relation to the casting animation and the speed of it therein being the thing that is the balancing factor, right? And it's like, if you're truly worried about balance in relation to consumable buff-based items and things like that, you would balance it based off of the amount of time that it exists on the player character for, not a, this only takes a second to cast, this one only takes 4 seconds to cast, for instance, right? So that largely gets a lot of the buff-based consumables out of the way. A couple other things I wanted to touch on here are the baseline greases, as you can see here, right? All of these ones are the more lengthy cast animation forms of the greases. They are not the drawstring versions, which are the quicker to cast, but they last a fraction of the amount of time of a traditional applied grease, right? And in Nightreign, what they did was they made all of the baseline greases, the bigger ones, utilize the drawstring grease animation, right? Which I'm not necessarily suggesting that they swap all of those animations to the drawstring grease animation, but I think the baseline grease animation should get sped up significantly, you know? That's once again, it's along the lines of everything we've already talked about. The normal grease animation is way too slow, dude. You know, like you shouldn't be taking that amount of time to rub on some grease, dude. You know, believe you me, I know, dude. So that being said, moving on to the other one here, so we got the shield grease, right? And the shield grease is very much in the exact same boat, you know, as everything else I just mentioned here. Just a ridiculously long animation. It should definitely not be taking that duration of time to put a little bit of grease on said shield, dude. And as you'll see here in the showcase, they made that significantly faster too, you know? Especially for like reapplications in terms of, you know, a PvE context and things like that. It's like, yeah, probably deserves to be a little bit quicker there, right? So, but obviously I am aware, you know, being a PvP enjoyer myself, shield grease, especially when paired with the dueling shields that were added in the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC for the base game, they are a little bit too strong in that way, right? Even when you're putting shield grease on any sort of shield, especially great shields in PvP and stuff like that, but that's a whole other tangent, dude, you know? Shield grease probably just needs to be reduced in effectiveness in terms of a PvP context to solve that issue, right? But yeah, speeding it up would be pretty freaking cool, dude. Alright, dude. On to the next section, dude. Woo! In the wake of Guardian's big beautiful wing, dude, it appears to me that I still have a couple more things to showcase. So I suppose we could start with the good old warming stone, dude. Brighten up everybody's day just a little bit. So, with the warming stone, there's a couple of improvements here. Maybe just one, but as I mentioned earlier in the video, a lot of the consumable item animations, when you use them, they allow you to have full maneuverability over your character to maintain that full semblance of movement, right, and controllability while you are using said consumable, right? And that's largely been increased across the board. And obviously, if you guys are familiar with the animation in the base game with the warming stones, you do not have full frameability, and it also roots you in place when you drop the stone, right? So just these two improvements here, allowing full character control and maneuverability while casting the animation, is a exceptional change, you know? Not too much else to say on the warming stone front there, but a very similar thing can also be said about the Bewitching branch, right? Which is a consumable that is largely, like, never engaged with by the vast majority of players, I would imagine. You know, it allows you to charm certain enemies and make them fight for you, right? Obviously, the speed improvement here with the Bewitching branch is absolutely exceptional, and having a little bit more maneuverability and free aim ability over the animation as well, right? So yeah, that's those two things out of the way. This animation, this drinking animation for this respective perfume, and of course, once again, same animation as the Ironjar Aromatic, so unbelievably slow, dude, and roots you in place in the base game, which just feels so terrible to interface with. Good luck trying to utilize it in the in the heat of battle, right? But yeah, so as you can see here, significantly faster, dude, and allows you the ability to move, you know? And I guess this is a good time to bring up just the fact that, like, even if From Software doesn't feel comfortable making these animations this fast for pretty much everything that we've showcased here today, right? Just the ability to have full maneuverability during the entirety of the animation is so important, dude. Because there's certain scenarios, both in PvP and PvE, where just the ability to continuously walk backward during the animation can be the difference between fucking getting hit and not. Which, that's a very cool thing, right? But yeah, overall, just speeding up the animation and giving the ability to walk while drinking it, dude. Dude, the Iron Bird, dude. Say hello to the Iron Bird, dude. Here he is, dude. What a sight to behold, dude. Yeah, I think that covers everything I wanted to touch on today, dude. Alright, my friends, it's about that time. Thank you guys for taking the time. I know this was a very long one. The consumable front is a hole very deep indeed. And as much as I'd like to stick around and chat about deep holes, I'm afraid there's just not enough time in the day. So with all that being said, if you guys enjoyed today's video, feel free to share it with a homie, drop a like, and of course, if you're feeling extra special, dude, feel free to subscribe. There's lots more content like this to come, dude. Bye for now, everybody. I'll see you next time.